The most dangerous moment for a narcissist isn't when the empath cries, pleads, or fights back. It's when the empath goes quiet and means it. Because when an empath is fed up, they don't become cruel, they become clear. And clarity is something a narcissistic personality cannot survive. If you're starting to recognize yourself here, if your silence feels powerful instead of painful, pause for a moment, ground yourself. And if this resonates, stay with this conversation because understanding this shift is how you protect it. When an empath becomes dangerous, it has nothing to do with aggression, revenge, or cruelty. It comes from emotional clarity, which is far more destabilizing to a narcissistic dynamic than anger ever could be. Emotional clarity means the empath finally sees the pattern without minimizing it, excusing it, or personalizing it. They no longer confuse intensity with intimacy or chaos with connection. This clarity dismantles the illusion that kept the narcissistic dynamic alive. For a long time, the empath's empathy worked against them. They over identified with the other person's pain, took responsibility for emotional outcomes that were never theirs to manage, and stayed invested in fixing what was never fixable. Once clarity arrives, that self blame dissolves. The empath understands that their compassion was used as leverage, not appreciated as a gift. That realization changes their nervous system response entirely. A narcissistic personality relies on confusion, emotional reactivity, and self doubt in others to maintain control. Emotional clarity removes all three at once. The empath stops reacting impulsively. They stop defending themselves against distortions. They stop engaging in circular conversations designed to exhaust them. This isn't coldness, it's regulation. And regulation is threatening to someone who thrives on dysregulation. What makes this dangerous is that clarity cannot be manipulated. You can provoke anger, you can exploit guilt, you can inflame fear, but you cannot destabilize someone who understands exactly what is happening and why they are no longer participating. The empath's calm becomes a mirror reflecting the narcissist's lack of control, and that reflection is intolerable. Clarity also removes the narcissist's ability to rewrite the narrative. The empath no longer needs to convince anyone of their reality. They trust their perception. They don't chase validation. They don't over explain. This creates a power vacuum because the narcissist's influence depended on the empath's emotional availability. This is why a fed up empath is perceived as dangerous, not because they are attacking, but because they are no longer accessible to manipulation, no longer emotionally pliable, and no longer willing to carry a story that was never true. Detachment is dangerous because it removes the narcissist's primary source of power, emotional access. Control in these dynamics is never about authority or dominance in a traditional sense. It is about proximity to another person's inner world. As long as the empath is emotionally engaged, trying to explain, repair, soothe, or be understood, the narcissistic dynamic stays alive. Detachment shuts that system down completely. When an empath detaches, they are not withdrawing to punish or provoke. They are withdrawing because their nervous system has learned that engagement is unsafe. This is not silent treatment. This is self-protection. The empath stops offering emotional data, no reassurance, no vulnerability, no reactive emotion to study or exploit. Without that information, the narcissist loses leverage. Narcissistic control relies on predictability. They know which buttons produce guilt, which comments spark self-doubt, which accusations trigger over-explaining. Detachment disrupts this entirely. The empath no longer follows the script. They don't rush to clarify misunderstandings. They don't defend their character. They don't chase emotional resolution. This creates a destabilizing uncertainty the narcissist cannot tolerate. What makes this especially threatening is that detachment is invisible. There is no argument to win, no behavior to correct, no reaction to dominate. The empath may appear calm, polite, even indifferent, but internally, they have exited the emotional contract. The narcissist senses this immediately because the usual emotional feedback loop is gone. Without emotional supply, the narcissist is forced to confront internal emptiness, shame, and lack of control. This often leads to escalation, provocations, sudden kindness, manufactured crises, anything to pull the empath back into emotional engagement. The goal is not reconciliation, it is restoration of access. Detachment also exposes the truth of the dynamic. If the relationship only functions when one person is emotionally overgiving and self erasing, then it was never mutual. The empath's withdrawal highlights this imbalance without saying a word. This is why detachment feels like a threat. It cannot be argued with, negotiated, or manipulated. It doesn't announce itself. It simply removes the oxygen from a system that depended entirely on emotional extraction. When a fed up empath stops explaining, fixing, and absorbing blame, the entire narcissistic dynamic collapses because those behaviors were the hidden scaffolding holding it together. For a long time, the empath acted as the emotional translator, smoothing over conflicts, reframing hurtful behavior, and taking responsibility for outcomes that were never theirs to carry. This constant self adjustment made the relationship appear functional when it was not. Explaining was never about communication, it was about survival. The empath believed that if they could just say it the right way, provide enough context, or show enough understanding, the other person would finally respond with empathy. But in narcissistic dynamics, explanations are not processed as information, they are used as data. Each explanation reveals values, fears, vulnerabilities, and limits, all of which can later be exploited. Fixing served a similar role. The empath became the regulator of emotional chaos, stepping in to stabilize moods, prevent blowups, and repair damage after every rupture. This positioned the empath as the caretaker of the narcissist's emotional world, while their own needs were deprioritized or dismissed. Over time, this creates exhaustion, resentment, and loss of self, even though the empath may not recognize it yet. Absorbing blame was the most damaging part. The empath internalized criticism, accepted distorted narratives, and questioned their own perception to keep the peace. They became the container for shame that the narcissist could not tolerate within themselves. This allowed the narcissist to remain unaccountable while the empath carried the emotional cost. When the empath stops doing these things, there is no longer anyone managing the emotional imbalance. Conversations end instead of looping. Accusations fall flat instead of being defended against. Problems remain unresolved instead of being patched over. This is deeply destabilizing to the narcissist because the usual mechanisms of control no longer work. The empath's refusal to overfunction is not cruelty, it is self restoration. By stepping out of the role of explainer, fixer, and emotional scapegoat, the empath reclaims their energy and their reality. What feels like abandonment to the narcissist is actually the empath choosing integrity over self erasure. Silence from an empath is often misunderstood as avoidance, weakness, or passive aggression. but in reality, it is informed restraint. It comes after patterns have been observed, tested, and confirmed. This silence is not impulsive, it is data driven. The empath has already said everything that needed to be said, often many times, in many ways, with patience and emotional labor that went unreciprocated. When they stop speaking, it is because more words would only serve the other person, not the truth. In narcissistic dynamics, communication is rarely about mutual understanding. It is about control, dominance, and emotional extraction. The empath eventually realizes that every attempt to clarify is twisted, every vulnerability is later weaponized, and every boundary is reframed as cruelty. Silence becomes the only response that does not feed the cycle. This is not stonewalling meant to punish. It is strategic disengagement meant to protect. Informed silence signals that the empath no longer believes the other person is capable of accountability or empathy. That realization is profound. It means the empath has stopped expecting emotional reciprocity where none exists. They are no longer trying to educate, persuade, or be seen. They understand that being understood was never the goal of the dynamic in the first place. This kind of silence is dangerous to a narcissistic personality because it removes the stage. There is no audience, no emotional reaction to provoke, no narrative to hijack. Silence denies access to the empath's inner world, which was once an open resource. Without commentary, the narcissist cannot triangulate, distort, or bait effectively. Silence also reflects internal alignment. The empath's thoughts, emotions, and behaviors are no longer in conflict. They are no longer saying one thing while feeling another. This congruence creates a calm that cannot be destabilized by manipulation. The narcissist senses this shift immediately because confusion and self-doubt were the cracks they relied on. What looks like withdrawal is actually resolution. The empath has already processed the grief, the anger, and the disappointment internally. Their silence is the sound of closure forming, not a tactic designed to elicit response, but a natural consequence of no longer needing to prove, explain, or defend a reality that has already been accepted. When an empath finally sets and maintains boundaries, those boundaries do more than protect the empath. They expose the other person's internal fragility. Boundaries are not demands, punishments, or ultimatums. They are limits on access. And for a narcissistic personality, limited access feels like an existential threat. It reveals how dependent they were on unrestricted emotional availability to feel regulated and powerful. For a long time, the empath's lack of boundaries was misinterpreted as flexibility or forgiveness, when in reality, it was self-abandonment. They tolerated disrespect, inconsistency, and emotional volatility because they prioritized harmony over safety. Once boundaries are in place, that tolerance disappears. The empath no longer negotiates their basic needs or explains why respect matters. The boundary simply exists. This is where fragility becomes visible. Healthy individuals may feel disappointed by boundaries, but they can adapt. A narcissistic personality experiences boundaries as rejection, control, or attack because they challenge the belief that they are entitled to unlimited access. The resulting reactions, rage, guilt tripping, victimhood, or contempt, are not caused by the boundary itself, but by the sudden loss of dominance. Boundaries also eliminate ambiguity. The empath is no longer sending mixed signals by accepting behavior that hurts them while verbally expressing discomfort. Their actions and values align. This alignment removes the narcissist's ability to exploit confusion or push limits incrementally. Each attempt to violate the boundary now reveals intention rather than misunderstanding. What makes this especially destabilizing is that boundaries force the narcissist to confront their lack of emotional resilience. Without someone cushioning consequences, absorbing outbursts, or restoring equilibrium, their dysregulation becomes obvious. The empath's steadiness highlights the contrast between emotional maturity and emotional dependence. These boundaries are not loud. They do not require confrontation or justification. They are upheld through consistency, not explanation. And that consistency is what exposes fragility most clearly. The narcissist can no longer frame the empath as the problem without their participation. In choosing boundaries, the empath reclaims authorship over their life and nervous system. The danger from the narcissist's perspective is not the boundary itself, but what it reveals, that their influence was never strength, only access, and access has now been revoked. When the empath emotionally withdraws, the power imbalance that once defined the relationship collapses almost instantly. Narcissistic dynamics are asymmetrical by design. One person overgives, overfeels, and overinvests, while the other extracts, reacts, and controls. The empath's emotional availability was the currency that kept this imbalance intact. Once that currency is removed, the structure has nothing left to stand on. Power in these relationships never came from strength or confidence. It came from emotional dependence. The narcissist relied on the empath to regulate tension, absorb volatility, and provide constant feedback about importance and relevance. The empath's emotional presence functioned as a stabilizing force, even while it slowly depleted them. When that presence disappears, the narcissist loses the leverage that made the imbalance possible. Emotional withdrawal is not dramatic. There is no announcement, no confrontation, no final argument. That is what makes it so effective. The empath simply stops centering the other person emotionally. Their thoughts no longer orbit around how to avoid conflict, fix misunderstandings, or restore connection. Attention shifts inward. Energy returns to the self. This internal reorientation quietly dismantles the hierarchy that once existed. Without the empath's emotional investment, attempts at dominance fall flat. Provocations do not land. Manipulation loses traction. Emotional intensity no longer produces compliance. The narcissist may escalate behaviors, not because they are gaining power, but because they feel it slipping away. What once guaranteed control now produces nothing. The collapse of the power imbalance also reveals how one-sided the connection always was. If influence only exists when one person is emotionally overextended, then it was never mutual. The empath's withdrawal exposes this truth without accusation or explanation. The relationship can no longer perform as it once did because the emotional labor sustaining it has ended. This shift is deeply destabilizing because it removes predictability. The narcissist can no longer anticipate reactions, manage outcomes, or script interactions. The empath is no longer emotionally available on demand. They respond, if at all, from choice rather than obligation. What replaces the imbalance is not revenge or dominance, but neutrality. The empath's emotional independence removes the other person's perceived authority. Control cannot exist where emotional attachment has been released, and hierarchy cannot survive when one participant has stepped out of the game entirely. When an empath stops participating in narrative distortion, the entire illusion that protected the narcissistic dynamic begins to unravel. Narrative distortion is not just lying. It is the constant reshaping of reality to avoid accountability and preserve control. For a long time, the empath unknowingly assisted in this process by questioning their own memory, softening facts, and giving the benefit of the doubt long past what was reasonable. The empath's role was often to translate harm into misunderstanding. Hurtful behavior was reframed as stress, cruelty as insecurity, and inconsistency as confusion. This reframing allowed the narcissist to maintain a self-image of innocence or superiority, while the empath carried the cognitive and emotional burden of making the story make sense. Over time, reality became negotiable, and truth became exhausting to defend. When the empath stops engaging in this distortion, they no longer argue about facts or intent. They stop trying to prove what happened or how it felt. They recognize that clarity does not require agreement. This is a critical shift. The empath understands that being gaslit was not a failure of intelligence, but a consequence of sustained emotional manipulation. Refusing to participate in narrative distortion removes the narcissist's ability to control the story. There is no longer a willing co-author. Accusations are not countered. Revisions of history are not corrected. The empath does not chase validation or attempt to restore a shared reality that never truly existed. This silence is not surrender, it is sovereignty. This is destabilizing because narcissistic control depends on confusion and self-doubt in others. When the empath trusts their perception and disengages from the debate, the narcissist is left alone with their version of events, which holds no power without an audience. Reality becomes fixed rather than fluid. The empath's internal narrative solidifies. They know what they experienced and no longer need external confirmation. This internal consistency creates emotional stability that cannot be undermined by manipulation or blame shifting. What makes this dangerous is not confrontation, but refusal. By stepping out of the distorted narrative, the empath dismantles the illusion quietly and permanently. The story no longer needs defending, correcting, or explaining. It simply exists as truth, held firmly by someone who has finally stopped negotiating their reality. Irrelevance is the deepest fear in a narcissistic dynamic because it threatens the very structure of identity that depends on external validation. Conflict, admiration, anger, and even criticism all serve a purpose as long as they confirm significance. For a narcissistic personality, being emotionally reacted to means being real. Being ignored means disappearing. The empath once provided constant confirmation of importance through attention, emotional investment, and responsiveness. Even distress or confrontation reinforced relevance because it proved that the narcissist still occupied space in the empath's inner world. When that reaction disappears, the narcissist experiences something far more destabilizing than rejection: emotional erasure. This is why irrelevance provokes more panic than boundaries or criticism. Boundaries can be challenged, criticism can be dismissed or attacked, but irrelevance offers no point of entry. The empath is no longer tracking moods, anticipating needs, or adjusting behavior to maintain equilibrium. Their focus has shifted elsewhere, and that shift is final. Without an audience, the narcissist's performance collapses. There is no feedback loop to confirm